What if the most brilliant person in your company was the one cleaning the floors? And what if you never knew because you never bothered to ask? For 8 years, Evelyn Barrett moved through the halls of Northwest Dynamics like a ghost unseen, unacknowledged, underestimated. She emptied the trash, scrubbed the glass, smiled quietly and spoke only when necessary. Until one morning, the CEO overheard her speaking flawless Russian to a delivery man, then German, then Polish, and just like that, everything changed. But here's the real question. If you were in Evelyn's shoes, brilliant, overlooked, surviving, would you step forward when no one asked, or would you stay silent, knowing the world had already decided where you belonged? This isn't a story about luck or pity. It's about unseen excellence, about a woman who carried 9 languages in her mind while carrying other people's trash in her hands. And it's about the moment when one man looked a little closer and saw what the world had ignored. If you believe that value has nothing to do with titles and that courage often speaks in whispers, please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Now, let's begin Evelyn's story, the janitor who changed everything simply by being undeniable. The floor of the main lobby at Northwest Dynamics always carried the echo of hurried steps and corporate ambition. Shoes clicked against the polished tiles like ticking clocks. Conversations about deadlines, budgets, and circle-back emails buzzed in the air like fluorescent lights, constant, mildly annoying, and easy to tune out. It was a Tuesday morning in early February, and outside, snow fell in thick, lazy flakes across Colorado Springs. Inside, warmth hummed through the vents, along with the low murmur of a television tuned to the business channel in the waiting area. No one paid it much attention. No one paid much attention to Evelyn Barrett, either. She was there most mornings before the executives arrived, wearing navy blue coveralls with her ID badge clipped near her collarbone. Evelyn moved with quiet precision, dusting picture frames, wiping down elevator buttons, straightening magazines no one really read. She kept her white blonde hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and wore glasses with wire-thin frames. If she spoke, it was soft. "Good morning. Excuse me, I'll just be a minute." The kind of voice that evaporated before it could linger. But that morning, Thomas Greer, CEO of Northwest Dynamics, heard something he hadn't expected. He was walking through the lobby with a cup of burnt office coffee in hand, thumbing through the latest sales brief on his tablet, when he paused near the visitor desk. A delivery man, clearly lost, was gesturing at the building directory, his English broken and hesitant. Then came her voice. It cut through the corporate hum like a cello note in a room full of static. The words were fluid, confident, Russian, spoken with the kind of fluency that didn't come from a translation app. Greer blinked, looked up, and saw Evelyn pointing the man toward the elevators, her tone calm, helpful. She even smiled, a small, practiced smile, the kind you wear when you're used to being overlooked. He stood still for a second. Maybe it was a fluke, he thought. A memorized sentence, a phrase picked up from television. But then she turned to a second man, this time an IT technician, holding a box of server parts, and began speaking to him in German, just as smoothly. Something tightened in his chest. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't normal. He took a step closer, and she caught sight of him. Her expression didn't change, but she straightened just slightly, like someone expecting to be told they were in the way. "Morning. Mr. Greer," she said in English. He nodded, still watching her. "That was Russian, wasn't it?" "Yes, sir," she replied simply. "And German?" "Yes, you speak both." Her eyes didn't flicker, and several others. There was no arrogance in her tone, no coyness, just a fact, laid out like a folded towel. Efficient. Undeniable. Greer paused. He wasn't sure what to say next. He looked down at the box of cleaning supplies in her cart. Windex, disposable gloves, microfiber cloths. It didn't match the voice he'd just heard. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" he asked. She hesitated. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the kind of pause people use when they're used to being spoken around, not to. Then she gave a small nod. "Yes, of course." As they walked toward the elevators, Greer noticed something odd for the first time in a long time. He felt like the one who didn't understand the language of the room. He'd built this company from a struggling startup into an international logistics powerhouse. He had teams in over a dozen countries, high-level consultants, branding experts, cultural advisors, and yet this woman, who had mopped these very floors for nearly a decade, had just shifted his entire perception of value. As they stepped into the elevator, Evelyn asked softly, "Is everything all right, sir?" He looked at her, the fluorescent light catching the silver in her hair. "I think I just realized I've been blind to something important," he said. The doors closed between them and the rest of the building. The elevator moved slowly, like it knew something important was happening inside. Evelyn stood to one side, hands clasped lightly in front of her, her work gloves still on. Thomas Greer tapped the button for the executive floor and glanced over, unsure how to start. For a man who often delivered keynote speeches without notes, this felt oddly like walking a tightrope. "You've worked here how long?" he asked finally. 8 years this spring," Evelyn replied. "I don't think we've ever spoken before." She smiled faintly. "You've nodded a few times. That counts for something." Greer chuckled under his breath. "I suppose it does." The elevator hummed upward. Floors ticked past. Then he asked what had been turning in his head since the lobby. "How many languages do you speak, if you don't mind me asking?" She tilted her head slightly, as if doing a quiet inventory. 9 fluently. I can read and write in 10. A few others I can get by in, but I wouldn't claim fluency. He raised an eyebrow. "That's rare." She shrugged. "It's just what I do. I don't knit. I don't bowl. I study languages. Where did you learn them? School, books, people, life." It was a list that felt longer than the words suggested. There was no bravado in her tone, no performance. She answered like someone used to not being believed and no longer bothered to convince anyone. "You ever use them here?" he asked. Evelyn hesitated. "Sometimes," she said. "I've helped visitors find their way, translated a few manuals when no one else could. Nothing official. No one's noticed. Most people don't ask what I notice or what I know." Greer nodded slowly. The elevator dinged and opened into the executive corridor, all hardwood floors, modern art, and citrus-scented air. Evelyn paused, her boots quiet on the polished floor. She looked almost out of place and at the same time, like she belonged more than anyone. He led her into his office, a wide, glass-paneled room overlooking the mountains. He gestured to a leather chair. She sat carefully, her eyes scanning the room, the framed degrees on the wall, the awards, the sleek furniture. She didn't look impressed, just aware. "I wasn't expecting this today," he said, settling across from her. "Neither was I." He folded his hands. "You don't mind if I ask you something personal?" "Depends on the question," she said, with just enough humor to soften it. Greer smiled. "Fair enough. Evelyn, how does someone like you end up working night shifts, mopping floors with your abilities?" There it was, the question so many might think, but few ever asked. She looked out the window for a moment, then back at him. "Do you want the polite answer, or the true one? I'll take the truth," he said. She nodded. "All right then." She took a slow breath. "I was raised in a small town in Nebraska. My dad ran a feed store. My mom worked at the library. We didn't have much, but I grew up around words, books, stories. My mother taught me French before I turned 10. In high school, I picked up German and Latin. I got into University of Chicago with a scholarship. Majored in linguistics." "That tracks," Greer said softly. "I was halfway through a dual master's when my father had a stroke. I came home to take care of him. A year later, my mother was diagnosed with ALS. I became a full-time caregiver, dropped out. My younger brother couldn't help, he had his own family. And it wasn't his fault. I don't blame anyone." She paused, fingers knitting together. "After they passed, I moved here with my daughter, started over, took whatever job I could get. I was a waitress, ran the cash register at a hardware store. This janitorial job was steady, paid just enough, and gave me time to pick up my kid from school." She looked him in the eye then. "I didn't stop studying. I just stopped being seen." Greer sat back. Something in him, something older, deeper responded to that line like a tuning fork. I just stopped being seen. That's a hard truth, he said quietly. Evelyn gave a small smile. The world doesn't have to be cruel to forget you. Sometimes it just gets busy. He leaned forward. You ever think of doing something more with your language as I did? I do. But it's hard to plan when rent's due, and your kid needs braces. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just full. Then she said something unexpected. You're wondering what to do with this now, aren't you? He blinked. Excuse me. You're wondering what it means for the company, for me, for you. You're trying to figure out if helping me is the right thing, or just a distraction from your usual agenda. Greer laughed once, dry and honest. You don't miss much. Do you? She shook her head. Not usually. He tapped a pen on the edge of his notebook. Well, Evelyn, I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out. With your permission. She tilted her head. What does that look like for starters? He said, you joining me in a meeting this afternoon. We've got a group flying in from Poland. The translator we booked canceled this morning. Her eyes widened slightly, surprised but composed. Polish, he asked. Tak. She replied, fluent. Then I'd consider this our first experiment. She nodded slowly. All right. He stood. She rose as well, quietly, as she stepped out of the office. Greer remained seated for a moment longer. He looked out at the snow-capped peaks and whispered to no one in particular, maybe I haven't been looking close enough. The conference room was quiet after the Polish delegation left. Papers were stacked neatly, coffee cups emptied, polite goodbyes exchanged. Evelyn had translated every word with fluidity and grace, her voice steady but never loud like a clear stream moving over stone. As the door closed behind the guests, Thomas Greer glanced at her. That was flawless. Evelyn gave a small nod. They were kind, easy to work with. He wanted to say more, to praise her, but she was already gathering used cups into a tray back into the rhythm she'd lived for years, like slipping on an old coat. Do you ever let yourself feel proud? He asked. She paused, tray in hand. Pride, she said softly, is expensive when you're one bill away from broke. There it was again, that quiet honesty that hit harder than any boardroom critique. He watched as she straightened a chair, her movements slow and deliberate. Can I ask you something? She added, surprising him. Of course. Why did you notice today after 8 years? He didn't answer right away. He didn't have an easy one. Maybe I finally slowed down long enough to see something I should have noticed a long time ago. Evelyn gave a soft, understanding smile. That's how the world works. Mr. Greer, we only see what we're trained to see. The rest just blends in. That night, Evelyn drove home in her old Honda Civic, the heater squealing like a tired violin. Snow clung to the windshield in stubborn smears as the wipers struggled to keep up. Her small apartment, tucked above a second-hand bookstore, smelled of peppermint tea and aging paperbacks. She hung up her uniform, washed her hands with lavender soap, and sat at the kitchen table. Her daughter, Samantha, now 27, had called earlier that day to check in from Minneapolis. Evelyn had missed the call. She stared at her phone a moment before placing it down, unread. Then she opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet and pulled out a worn composition notebook. Inside were pages filled with word lists, Finnish, Urdu, Swahili handwritten notes, pronunciation guides, and grammar sketches. In the margins, she had scribbled quotes from books, lines from movies, and vocabulary from overheard conversations at the bus stop or grocery store. This was her life's work, invisible to everyone, but real. There was a time when it had all looked different. She had been 24 when she stepped into the lecture hall at the University of Chicago, full of hope and adrenaline. Her professor had once said she had a mind built for language, a perfect ear, relentless memory, and an almost eerie empathy for cadence. She dreamed of teaching, of traveling, of working with refugee centers, helping people feel seen in their own tongue. But then came the call. Her father collapsed behind the counter of the feed store, massive stroke, Then her mother's slow, cruel unraveling from ALS. Evelyn dropped everything, packed her life into 3 cardboard boxes, and went home. She had intended to return after a year, but 1 year became 2, then 3. The grants expired, the scholarships disappeared, friends stopped calling, professors retired. The world moved on while Evelyn took her mother to every appointment, changed linens, fed her soup, whispered encouragement into the dark. When her mother passed, Evelyn stood in the kitchen for hours, not knowing what to do with her hands. She took jobs, she kept her daughter fed, she answered the phone with a smile. But every night, when the house went still, she studied word by word, page by page, like a woman trying to keep a small fire, lit in a snowstorm. At work, no one asked. They saw a quiet woman with cleaning gloves. They saw a name tag, not a story. But Evelyn watched them all. She watched the interns nervously recite slides. She watched engineers whisper frustrations in Mandarin, thinking no one understood. She saw managers struggle with contracts written in poor French. She saw people trying and failing to connect across oceans. And still, she cleaned. With care. With presence. Because no matter where life had left her, she had not stopped showing up fully. But tonight, sitting in the warm glow of her table lamp, she felt something stirring. A small flicker of possibility, dangerous, unfamiliar, but bright. She picked up her pen. On the next blank page, she wrote in block letters, "What if it's not too late?" Then, below it, what would it look like to be seen? She stared at those words for a long time. They terrified her. The next morning, she walked into the building before sunrise as usual. The security guard nodded. She nodded back. She took the back elevator to the lower level, where bleach hung heavy in the air and fluorescent lights flickered overhead. She clocked in with the same old swipe, then made her way up, at her cart. She paused. She didn't start wiping counters right away. She stood still for a moment and listened, not to the building, but to herself. There was a quiet storm inside, not anger, not pride, something deeper. The ache of years spent being useful but unseen. The weight of dreams folded into Janitor's pockets. The strength it took to not become bitter. And now, for the first time in years, someone had looked her in the eye and asked her why. She wasn't sure if that changed everything, but it changed something. And sometimes, something was enough. The announcement came on a Thursday morning. It wasn't made with balloons or fanfare, just a crisp internal memo from Thomas Greer's office, sent company-wide. The subject line read, "New Appointment Cultural Liaison, International Affairs." The body of the email was brief and neutral in tone, but it carried weight, effective immediately. Evelyn Barrett will be joining the international operations team in the newly created role of Cultural Liaison. Evelyn brings with her a rare and exceptional linguistic fluency, as well as a unique perspective that will help deepen our cross-border partnerships. Please welcome her as she transitions into this position over the coming weeks. It landed in inboxes with a quiet ping, followed by a louder ripple of confusion. In the marketing lounge, 2 junior associates leaned over their lattes, squinting at the message. Wait. Evelyn Barrett, the Evelyn from Janitorial. No way. That has to be a typo. I've seen her mop the lobby like every day. You telling me she's fluent in 9 languages and they just what gave her a title? The other scoffed. I have a master's in international business and I've been here 4 years. Their voices dropped to a whisper. Maybe she's related to someone, or maybe Greer's trying to prove something. By lunch, the memo had reached every corner of Northwest Dynamics accounts payable, server rooms, HR, and even the company gym. No one had the full story, but everyone had opinions. Evelyn, meanwhile, was sitting in a temporary office on the 12th floor, bare walls, a standard issue desk, and a borrowed laptop. The badge around her neck was the same one she'd always worn. But now, when she walked down the hall, people looked up, some smiled awkwardly. Others looked through her like she was still invisible. A few simply stared. She tried not to notice. But she noticed everything. There was no orientation, no training session. Just a knock on the door at 2:15 p.m. A tall man in a fitted blazer stepped in. cold eyes, clipboard in hand. "Victor Lennox," he said curtly, "head of international operations." Evelyn stood, extending a hand. He looked at it for a second too long before shaking it. "So," he said, still standing, "you're the new liaison. That's what I've been told." He didn't smile. Instead, he placed a thick folder on her desk. Inside, 3 contracts, 2 unresolved vendor issues in Dubai, and a full backlog from our French distribution partner. Think you can manage? She opened the folder slowly, scanning the documents. "I'll need a few hours, but yes." Victor tilted his head. "You've never worked in corporate, right?" "Not officially," she replied, calm. "But I've read more memos than most interns, and I've corrected mistranslations in your Polish contracts that would have cost the company 6 figures. His jaw tightened just slightly. Then he turned and left without another word. Evelyn exhaled. That night, the elevator ride to the parking garage felt different. Not because she was tired, she always was, but because something in the air had shifted. Being unseen had its own kind of safety. Now, eyes were everywhere. She drove home in silence, radio off. At a red light, she thought about her old routine, the one where she blended in, made no waves, asked for nothing. And then she thought about Greer. Thomas Greer sat in his office that same evening, fingers steepled in thought. He knew the backlash would come, but he hadn't expected it to feel so familiar. He'd felt it years ago, walking into meetings with men who shook hands but never looked him in the eye. He remembered being dismissed for the way he dressed, the town he was from, the school he couldn't afford. Now he was on the other side of the table, and people were looking at him like he'd gone rogue. Hiring Evelyn hadn't been a gesture. It was strategy, smart strategy, but he also knew that wasn't enough for some. The system didn't like its hierarchies bent. He glanced out the window. Snow was beginning to fall again. He remembered Evelyn's face, composed, unbothered, unafraid, and that made him smile. The next morning, Evelyn arrived early. She reviewed the Dubai files, flagged 3 critical errors, and left detailed notes in the French contract about cultural tone that could smooth over tensions. She did it all quietly, without grandstanding, without even a by the way. By 10 a.m., Greer stopped by her office. "How's day 2?" he asked. She looked up from her screen. Less floor wax, more email. He grinned. "Victor, give you any trouble, he doesn't scare me," she said. "Matter of fact, didn't think he would." She hesitated, then added, "Can I ask you something? Always. Why me? You could have just given me a bonus and moved on, called it a good deed." He leaned against the doorframe. "Because I saw myself in you." She raised an eyebrow. "You were a janitor." "No." He laughed. "But I was underestimated, and I know what that does to a person." She nodded slowly. Now they were quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet, not from discomfort, but from recognition. Later that afternoon, as she walked past the HR desk, a woman called out to her quietly, "Evelyn." She turned. I just wanted to say congratulations. I don't know the whole story, but I'm glad someone saw you." Evelyn blinked once, surprised. "Thank you," she said. That night, in her notebook, she added another line. "Being seen isn't everything, but it's where everything begins." The message came through the company intranet, short, cold, and unsigned. "Ms. Barrett, please report to conference room 17B at 4:00 p.m. today for a scheduled review. No details, no explanation, just a room number and a time." Evelyn stared at the screen for a moment. She knew what this was. Not a check-in, not a warm welcome. It was a test, or maybe a trap. At 3:59 p.m., she smoothed her blazer, a soft gray piece she borrowed from a neighbor for this very purpose, and walked down the corridor. Her heels clicked against the tile floor, each step echoing louder than it should have. When she reached the door, it was already ajar. Inside sat a woman in her early 60s, with snow-white hair tied into a perfect knot. Her navy suit was tailored, pristine, almost military in its sharpness. She didn't look up from her folder. "Come in," the woman said without lifting her gaze. Evelyn stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. The woman finally looked up. Her eyes were hard and unreadable. "I'm Meredith Langston, Senior Board Advisor. I've been with Northwest Dynamics since before we had a website." Evelyn nodded. "Pleased to meet you." Langston tapped her pen twice on the desk. "So, Ms. Barrett, you've made quite an entrance. I didn't intend to—" Langston raised an eyebrow. "Intentions rarely matter. Outcomes do." She opened the folder and began to read. No college degree, no certifications, no corporate experience. Yet now, you're overseeing international vendor communications and providing real-time language support for high-level meetings. Evelyn said nothing. Langston looked up. "Can you explain to me, in your own words, how someone with your background qualifies for such a role?" Evelyn met her gaze. "I speak 9 languages fluently. I've corrected critical translation errors that cost us money. I've helped repair relationships with at least 3 international partners in under a week. I may not have a degree, but I have the results." Langston's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think that's enough to justify upending protocol years of policy, bypassing internal promotion procedures?" "No," Evelyn said quietly. "But it's enough to start asking why those procedures ignore people like me in the first place." Silence. Then Langston closed the folder with a firm snap. "You're a risk." Evelyn didn't flinch. "My entire life has been a risk. This company's just the first one willing to place a bet." Langston stood and walked to the window. Snowflakes drifted past the glass like lazy confetti. "You know what the others are saying," she said, her back to Evelyn. "That this is a PR stunt, that you're here to make someone look progressive, that when the buzz dies down, so will your relevance." "I've heard whispers," Evelyn replied, "and they don't scare me." Langston turned around, arms crossed. "You're calm. I'll give you that. But calm doesn't change the game." Evelyn nodded slowly. "No, but it survives it." There was a long pause, one heavy with unspoken rules, hierarchy, and generational tension. Then Langston walked back to the table and sat down. "You're an anomaly, Ms. Barrett, and anomalies threaten structure. I'm not trying to break anything," Evelyn said, "but I'm not going to apologize for being seen." Langston studied her for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, she closed the folder and slid it aside. "I'll be watching." Evelyn didn't move. "I assumed you already were." The meeting ended without ceremony. No handshake, no welcome aboard. Just a subtle nod as Evelyn exited the room. Outside, the hallway seemed colder. She took the elevator down, her reflection flickering in the mirrored panels. For the first time in days, her hands trembled, just slightly. Not from fear, but from pressure, the weight of being visible. She stepped outside into the cold evening air and crossed the street to a small park bench across from the building. The sun had dipped below the mountains, leaving the city painted in muted lavender. Evelyn pulled out her phone and dialed. "Hey, Ma," came the voice of Samantha, warm and alert. "Hey, sweetheart, you okay? I just needed to hear your voice." Samantha was quiet for a moment. "Rough day." Something like that. They talked for a few minutes about the new movie Samantha wanted to see, the pasta she'd cooked for dinner, how her dog had stolen half a baguette. Evelyn didn't say much, but the sound of her daughter's laughter grounded her. When they hung up, she stayed seated, watching the building across the street, its steel and glass, its endless fluorescent glow. So many nights. She had cleaned its floors. So many years. She had wondered if anyone saw her. Now they did, and some didn't like it. But she was still there, and she wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, something strange happened. On the whiteboard outside her office, written in marker without a name, "We see you," 3 simple words. And for the first time that week, Evelyn let herself smile. Tui TV I, Sao Q C I U C Nang, TH Nang Trong PH and Shinj, Evelyn Barrett V N Kong Chun B Shi. Trong PHN 6, Ripples, Chungtas Tayan Heshaning C, A Ko BT Ulantia, Kong Shabing Canon Nung, Mabiring Cage Ko Hianandina, Catch Ko El Sengang He, catch ko kien tangi cuts, CM hatch se English code sin hintai. I la fishnan nang TMCM ksu, sinang si hinch titong Evelyn, nature MTBU nong VEL nong L H nong sao SC. Part 6, Ripple's word, count 1,000 words. The air was different. Not louder, just more aware. People didn't exactly greet Evelyn in the halls, not at first, but they noticed her now, paused a second longer, lowered their voices when she passed. Some out of respect, others out of discomfort. But what struck Evelyn most was how often people came to her with things that had nothing to do with her job. An intern knocked on her door one morning with a red face and a trembling notepad. "Ms. Barrett," he said nervously, "I have a presentation later today. It's for the South Korea team. My Korean isn't great, just Duolingo. Could you—" She waved him in before he finished. "Let's go through it together," she said, offering him the chair beside her. Another day, someone from tech support asked her, quietly, how to greet an Arabic-speaking client without sounding awkward. Evelyn didn't roll her eyes. She didn't correct. She taught. Softly. Patiently. The way her mother used to teach her how to hold a sentence in her mouth like warm tea. It wasn't part of her title, but it became part of her presence. One afternoon, Thomas Greer joined her in the break room. He poured himself coffee, leaned against the counter, and said without preamble, "Been hearing good things." Evelyn sipped her tea, been trying to ignore the bad ones. He chuckled. "You're making waves." She looked at him evenly. "That a good thing?" He nodded. "Around here, it means you're doing something right." They stood for a moment in shared silence. Then Greer said, "You ever think about starting something more formal?" She raised an eyebrow. "Formal A program. For internal development. We have good people working in jobs they've outgrown. People like you. People who haven't been seen yet," she added. He smiled. "Exactly." She didn't answer right away. "I've been thinking about that too," she said finally. "I even have a name." He turned to her, intrigued. "Let's hear it." Voice inside. Greer said nothing for a beat. Then he nodded, slowly. That's good." By month's end, the pilot program launched quietly. Voice Inside was designed to identify overlooked talent across all departments, janitorial, reception, maintenance, entry-level support, and offer access to language classes, cultural mentorship, and soft skill training. The response was cautious at first, but then the applications began arriving, and not just from night shift workers, from people across the company who'd been hiding talents behind job titles. People started coming out of the woodwork. One spoke Tagalog and Farsi. Another played cello in a regional orchestra, but had never felt confident enough to mention it. The program became more than a development tool. It became a mirror. And Evelyn. She mentored. She reviewed language samples. She hosted low-pressure coffee roundtables for those who wanted to practice speaking aloud. No judgment, just space, just dignity. In early April, she was invited to speak at the company's annual leadership retreat. The room was packed, executives, managers, department heads. She walked to the center of the stage with steady steps, adjusted the mic, and took a breath. "My name is Evelyn Barrett," she began. "You probably knew me before you knew me." A few nervous chuckles. "For 8 years. I worked here as a janitor. I cleaned your hallways, emptied your trash, and made sure the elevator buttons didn't stick. I also speak 9 languages. I've studied cross-cultural communication, linguistics, and negotiation for most of my adult life." She paused, looking slowly around the room. No one ever asked. The room was still. I don't say this for pity or applause. I say it because we don't always see what's right in front of us. We build entire systems assuming talent comes dressed a certain way, from certain schools, with certain voices. Another pause. I was never just a janitor. I was fluent. I was capable. I was ready. But no one looked long enough to see it. A breath. Measured. Soft. Firm. So the next time you pass someone without a title, ask yourself, what are you really missing? The room stayed silent, then stood, every chair, every suit. Full applause. But Evelyn wasn't looking for the claps. She was looking for the faces, and in them, She saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Possibility. After the talk, a young man approached her with tears in his eyes. "My mom's a housekeeper," he said. "She speaks 5 languages. I used to be embarrassed to say that." Evelyn reached for his hand, touched it gently. "Don't ever be ashamed of where you come from," she said. "The only thing to be ashamed of is staying blind to brilliance." He nodded, eyes glistening. And Evelyn walked away, feeling taller than she ever had in her life. Not because of a promotion, not because of applause, but because she hadn't had to change who she was to get here. She brought all of it, all the layers, the silences, the grit, and that made all the difference. It started with a missing plaque. One Tuesday morning, just before the quarterly team onboarding, someone noticed the silver nameplate above the company's largest training room was gone. The brushed metal rectangle that used to read Founders Hall had been removed overnight. In its place, a new plaque had been installed. The Evelyn Barrett Room. No announcement, no memo, no ribbon cutting, just 4 simple words, engraved cleanly, framed in walnut, mounted with purpose. The change rippled through the building like a quiet gasp. Someone in HR whispered, "She doesn't even have a degree." Someone from Global Operations muttered, "She has something better." And in the break room, someone wrote on the whiteboard, not a tribute, a correction. Thomas Greer stood outside the room that morning, coffee in hand, watching as a new cohort of interns filed in for orientation. They paused, glancing up at the new name. One of them, a young woman with a nervous smile, asked softly, "Who's Evelyn Barrett?" A senior staffer nearby answered without hesitation. She reminded this place that greatness doesn't always wear a suit. Greer smiled quietly, then turned and walked away. Later that afternoon, Evelyn found a sealed envelope on her desk. No return address, just her name in handwritten block letters. Inside was a simple card. "I used to think I'd be invisible forever. But today, I stood a little taller because of you. Thank you." No signature, but she didn't need one. Evelyn sat at her desk for a long while, staring at those words. Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. She didn't need to. Some moments are louder than tears. She opened the drawer and looked at her old janitor badge still there, tucked in a corner, a relic she couldn't part with. She ran her thumb over its edges. She didn't keep it out of nostalgia. She kept it to remember exactly what it took to get here. Weeks passed. The company moved on. Projects accelerated. Teams grew. But something subtle had shifted in the corridors of Northwest Dynamics. People looked a little longer, listened a little deeper, and sometimes, they asked, not everyone celebrated the change. A few held fast to their quiet resentments. But even they began to take notice when Evelyn corrected a legal phrasing in a German contract that saved the company over $200,000. Or when she caught a cultural miscue in a Vietnamese vendor call that could have stalled a deal for months. She never gloated. She simply worked, spoke when it mattered, listened when it counted, and always remained entirely herself. One Friday evening, long after most lights had gone out, Evelyn stood at the doorway of the training room that now bore her name. It was empty, silent. The chairs were stacked, the whiteboard wiped clean. She walked inside, ran her fingers across the edge of a table, and took a seat in the back row, the same place she used to occupy in classrooms, unseen, waiting for her turn to matter. Now, she didn't have to wait. She had built a door, and now she was holding it open. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Thomas Greer. He stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Figured I might find you here," he said, handing her one. She accepted it with a smile. "Thought you'd be gone by now. I wanted to say something." He sat beside her. "There's talk," he said, "at the board level, about creating a permanent internal academy training across departments, talent scouting, cultural fluency workshops. They want you to help lead it." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Even Langston." He grinned. "Especially Langston. She said you proved her wrong, and she doesn't say that often." Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "I'm not sure I'm the leading type." "You don't have to be loud to lead," he said. "You just have to be real." They sat for a moment, watching the room in quiet reflection. "You think they'll forget?" she asked. He shook his head. not this time. You put your name on the door. Outside, the sky was turning gold behind the mountains. And inside, Evelyn felt no need to rush. The work would still be there tomorrow. But for now, she let herself breathe. Fully, freely. Finally. Evelyn Barrett didn't ask to be a hero. She didn't storm the gates or demand a seat at the table. She simply showed up, every day, with quiet brilliance and a heart that never gave up, even when the world stopped seeing her. But let's be honest. How many Evelyns have we passed by without looking twice? How many voices have we silenced by assuming they belong in the background? Her story reminds us that greatness doesn't always come in a tailored suit. Sometimes it wears work boots. Sometimes it pushes a cleaning cart, but it speaks with clarity, moves with purpose, and waits for the moment someone finally chooses to listen. This isn't just Evelyn's story. It's a mirror, a question. What are we missing because we're looking the wrong way? If this story moved you, if it made you feel, reflect, or maybe even rethink the way you see others, then please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Because this is just one voice, and we're here to shine a light on many more. Until next time, remember, respect is not given by rank, it's earned by presence. And brilliance has never needed permission to be real.